The Sumerian king list names a man called Alulim, first king of the city of Eridu, and credits him with a reign of 28,800 years. Before the words, "Then the flood swept over," cut the record in two. Scribes writing 4,000 years ago treated that flood as fact, not folklore, and never explained what came before it. That's the kind of detail this collection is built on. Not vague legend, but specific numbers, names, and objects that don't add up, preserved by people who had no reason to lie and no way to check. 15 cases like it wait ahead. Cities, disappearances, artifacts, and records that contradict everything we think we know about how far back civilization goes. Some have partial answers. Most don't. Start with the flood before Sumer, and see how deep the pattern runs. The clay tablet is small enough to hold in one hand, roughly the size of a smartphone, its surface covered in the wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform script. It was recovered from the ruins of Nippur, one of the oldest cities of ancient Mesopotamia, and today it sits cataloged in a museum collection, largely unremarkable to the casual eye. But what it records is anything but ordinary. Among its lines is a list of kings, men said to have ruled southern Mesopotamia before history, as most of us understand it, even began. The document is known as the Sumerian King List, and it names Eridu as the first city where kingship descended from heaven. Its first king, Alulim, is said to have reigned for 28,800 years. His successors fare little better, reigns measured in the tens of thousands of years, stretched across what the text presents as 8 kings ruling 5 cities, for a combined total of 241,200 years. Then, without transition or explanation, the tablet states plainly, "Then the flood swept over." After that it says, "Kingship again descended from heaven," and the list resumes with mortal, plausible reigns, years and decades, not millennia. Historians generally treat the numbers before the flood as symbolic, perhaps tied to Mesopotamian numerical systems or religious cosmology rather than literal chronology. That reading makes sense on its own terms. What's harder to explain is the certainty embedded in the structure itself. The scribes who copied this list, across multiple versions in multiple cities over centuries, did not treat the flood as myth or metaphor. They treated it as a hinge point in real history, a literal before and after, as unremarkable to them as a change in dynasty. This is where the story widens. The flood referenced in the king list echoes throughout Mesopotamian literature, in the Eridu Genesis, in the Atrahasis epic, and later in the flood narrative embedded within the Epic of Gilgamesh, where a man named Utnapishtim survives a divine deluge by building a boat and preserving the seed of every living thing. The parallels to the biblical account of Noah are well documented, and scholars generally agree that these traditions share a common ancestry, likely rooted in real catastrophic flooding events along the Tigris and Euphrates river plains. Geological surveys at sites like and Shurapak have in fact revealed thick layers of water-laid silt, evidence of severe flooding at some point in the region's deep past. But here the mainstream explanation and the text begin to diverge. A regional flood, however devastating, would not erase a civilization's memory so cleanly that its own chroniclers drew a hard line through time itself. Why would scribes, otherwise careful record keepers, preserve absurd reign lengths for the era before the flood, yet shift immediately to sober, believable numbers afterward? Were they preserving something they didn't fully understand? Numbers inherited from an earlier tradition, copied faithfully because altering sacred record was forbidden? Or was the flood being used consciously as a narrative seam, a way to separate the mythic architects of civilization from the merely human kings who came after? Fringe researchers have gone further still, suggesting the pre-flood reigns encode something else entirely. Astronomical cycles, lost calendars, or garbled memories of a civilization older than Sumer itself. Mainstream archaeology finds little to support this, and yet the discomfort remains. A written record, thousands of years old, that treats a catastrophic flood as the literal boundary of civilized memory. What exactly sat on the other side of that line? a flood the Sumerians remembered but couldn't fully explain, or a memory reshaped so many times that its origin was lost long before anyone thought to write it down. Somewhere in the ruins of Babylon, centuries after the tablets of Nippur had already gone silent, a priest named Berossus sat down to write a history of his people for a Greek-speaking world that no longer read cuneiform. It was the early 3rd century BC, and Alexander's successors now ruled Mesopotamia. Berossus wrote in Greek, drawing, he claimed, on temple records stretching back thousands of years. His work, the Babyloniaca, survives today only in fragments, quoted by later historians like Eusebius and Syncellus. And in those fragments is a list that should sound familiar. 10 kings, ruling before a great flood, with reigns so long they defy calculation. Where the Sumerian king list named 8 kings across 5 cities before the deluge, Berossus counted 10. His first king, Aloris, reigns for what translates to roughly 36,000 years. The 10th and final king before the flood is a man named Xisuthros, and it is Xisuthros, not some unnamed everyman, who is warned by a god to build a vessel and preserve the seed of all living things. The parallel to Noah and to Utnapishtim before him is unmistakable, but something else stands out. Berossus places these kings not in vague mythic time, but within a structured chronology, one that later scholars have attempted, with mixed success, to reconcile with astronomical records the Babylonians were famous for keeping with extraordinary precision. This is the puzzle historians still turn over. The Babylonians were not a careless people when it came to numbers. Their astronomers tracked the movements of Venus across the sky for generations, recorded eclipses to the day, and built mathematical systems sophisticated enough that some of their methods for predicting planetary motion wouldn't be matched in Europe for nearly 2,000 years. These were not scribes prone to sloppy record-keeping or wild invention for its own sake. So when the same civilization, spanning different eras, different dynasties, different political centers, repeatedly preserved the idea of a handful of kings ruling for tens of thousands of years before a catastrophic flood, the question becomes harder to wave away. Why would a culture capable of such precision commit itself, generation after generation, to numbers that could not possibly be literal? The mainstream explanation leans on mathematics. Scholars have long noticed that many of the reign lengths in these king lists are divisible by the number 3,600, known as a sar, in the Babylonian sexagesimal counting system, which used base 60 rather than base 10. It's the same system that gave us 60 minutes in an hour and 360 degrees in a circle. If reigns were recorded in sars, enniars, and sasses, units of 3,600, 660, rather than single years, the numbers stop looking like fantasy and start looking like a scribal convention, perhaps a method of encoding smaller, more plausible figures within a symbolic or ceremonial framework tied to their calendar and their astronomy. Under this theory, the kings may have reigned for real spans of years, but the scribes recording them layered on a mathematical structure meant to convey something else entirely: status, sacredness, cosmic order, rather than a literal head count of years lived. It's a compelling explanation. It does not, however, fully explain everything. For one, the theory doesn't account for why this convention would be applied so consistently, across centuries and across 2 distinct written traditions, Sumerian and later Babylonian, that use different languages and, in Berossus's case, existed nearly 1,000 years after the original king lists were composed. If the numbers were simply a numerical flourish specific to one era's scribal fashion, why would a Hellenistic-era priest, drawing on temple archives, still be preserving the same essential structure: a small number of kings, unfathomable reigns, and a flood that ends it all? Was Berossus copying something he found in genuinely ancient records, records that had themselves preserved this pattern faithfully for 2 millennia? Or was he working from a tradition so deeply embedded in Mesopotamian religious identity that its shape had become fixed regardless of whether anyone still understood its original meaning? There's a second detail worth sitting with. In both the Sumerian and Babylonian versions, the Antediluvian kings aren't just long-lived. They are consistently associated with the transmission of civilization itself. In some traditions, they are advised or accompanied by beings called the Apkallu, 7 sages said to have emerged from the sea to teach humanity the arts of civilization: writing, agriculture, law, architecture. The Apkallu appear on Assyrian palace reliefs centuries later, carved as winged, fish-cloaked figures standing beside kings, as though their presence still mattered politically long after the flood they predated. Was this simply religious iconography, a way of legitimizing royal power through sacred ancestry? Or does it suggest something else? A folk memory, however distorted, of a genuine transitional period when whatever came before organized city life gave way, abruptly, to the world we would recognize as historical. Archaeology offers a partial, unsatisfying answer. We know Mesopotamian civilization did not spring up instantly. The transition from small agricultural settlements to the first true cities, places like Uruk and Eridu, took centuries, unfolding gradually across the 4th millennium BC. There is no archaeological evidence of kings reigning for tens of thousands of years, nor any evidence of a civilization existing in Mesopotamia deep enough in prehistory to accommodate such spans. And yet the tradition insists, repeatedly, independently, that something vast and foundational happened before the flood. Something worth remembering in numbers too large for ordinary kingship, guarded by sages and severed cleanly from everything that followed. Fringe theories have filled this gap in ways mainstream scholarship generally rejects. Proposals of forgotten epochs, lost technological knowledge, or civilizations far older than the archaeological record allows. These ideas rarely hold up under scrutiny, and most historians see the Antediluvian king lists as exactly what they appear to be: a powerful piece of ancient political theology, using myth and numerology to root fragile, real dynasties in something eternal and unchallengeable. But theology, too, has to come from somewhere. Every myth is built from something its authors believed mattered enough to preserve. So what exactly were the scribes of Sumer and Babylon protecting when they wrote these names down, generation after generation, city after city, always ending at the same catastrophic point? A political fiction refined over 2,000 years is its own kind of mystery. A folk memory stretched and reshaped past recognition is another. Perhaps both are true, layered over each other so many times that separating them is no longer possible. What remains is the shape of the story itself. Kings before the flood, teachers from the sea, a line drawn hard across time, repeated by people who had every reason to invent a founding myth, and yet chose, again and again, to build it around the same strange, specific detail. That before history as we know it began, someone was already counting. 600 miles northwest of Uruk, on a bend of the Euphrates in what is now northern Syria, archaeologists uncovered something that shouldn't have been there. The site is called Habuba Kabira, and beneath its soil lies a planned city, laid out with straight streets, defensive walls, and administrative buildings, built not by local Syrian communities, but by settlers whose pottery, architecture, and administrative tools are unmistakably Sumerian. It was, in every material sense, a piece of Uruk transplanted hundreds of miles from home, and it was only one node in something far larger. Between roughly 3700 and 3100 BC, the city of Uruk, by most measures the first true city on Earth, home to tens of thousands of people at its height, extended its reach across an enormous swath of the ancient Near East. Sites bearing unmistakable Uruk influence have been found not just at Habuba Kabira, but at Godin Tepe in the Zagros Mountains of Iran, at Hachanebi in southeastern Turkey, at Tel Brak in Syria, and dozens of smaller outposts scattered along river valleys and mountain passes stretching over 1,000 miles from the Mesopotamian heartland. Archaeologists call this the Uruk expansion, or sometimes the Uruk world system, a term deliberately echoing modern ideas of globalized trade networks, because that is, in miniature, what it resembled. Standardized pottery, shared administrative technology, including some of the earliest clay tokens and proto-writing used for tracking goods, a recognizable material culture, replicated with startling consistency across a landscape home to dozens of different peoples and languages. And then, within a few generations, it was gone. By around 3100 BC, nearly every one of these distant Uruk colonies had been abandoned, destroyed, or absorbed so completely that their Sumerian character disappeared from the archaeological record. Habuba Kabira was deserted. Contact between Uruk and the highland trade networks it once controlled seems to collapse almost simultaneously across sites separated by hundreds of miles. This is, on its face, one of the most abrupt disappearances of an early urban network in the archaeological record. And it happened at almost precisely the same time that Uruk itself, back in southern Mesopotamia, was entering major internal transformations of its own. The mainstream explanation begins with trade. Southern Mesopotamia is a resource-poor floodplain, extraordinary for agriculture, but almost entirely lacking in timber, metal ores, and building stone. Everything Uruk needed to sustain its growing population and its increasingly complex administrative class had to come from somewhere else. The colonies in this reading were never meant to be permanent cities in the way Uruk itself was. They were trade stations and way stations, established to secure access to copper from the Iranian plateau, timber from the Taurus Mountains, and other raw materials flowing down through river and mountain routes toward the Mesopotamian core. When local political conditions shifted, when highland societies in Iran and Anatolia grew strong enough, organized enough, or simply unwilling enough to keep hosting foreign enclaves, the network unraveled. Not because of catastrophe, this theory holds, but because it had, in a sense, done its job. Indigenous societies absorbed what they found useful from Uruk's technology and administrative systems, and no longer needed the colonists themselves. It's a reasonable account, and it fits much of the evidence. But it doesn't answer every question the collapse raises. For one, the timing is oddly precise. A gradual, economically driven withdrawal should leave a gradual archaeological signature, some sites persisting longer than others, a slow fade rather than a hard stop. Instead, many Uruk colonies show signs of rapid abandonment or violent destruction within a remarkably tight window, clustered right around 3100 BC. At some sites, there's evidence of burning, at others, simply sudden absence, a population that seems to vanish from the record in the space of a generation, without the kind of gradual decline you'd expect from a system winding down on its own terms. Why would a network built over 6 centuries collapse in the space of a few decades, across a geography too vast for any single local conflict to explain? There's a second layer to the mystery, and it concerns what was happening back home. This same period, the transition from roughly 3100 BC onward, known to archaeologists as the shift from the Uruk period into the Jemdet Nasr period, coincides with major upheaval within southern Mesopotamia itself. Some of Uruk's own monumental structures, including sections of its famous Iana temple precinct, appear to have been deliberately dismantled and rebuilt during this era, an act that some scholars read as evidence of religious or political conflict at the very center of the system. Was the collapse of the colonial network a cause of instability back home? The sudden loss of resources and revenue destabilizing Uruk's ruling institutions? Or was it a consequence? Turmoil inside Uruk itself severing the political will and manpower needed to maintain distant outposts. The archaeological record, frustratingly, allows either reading, and the honest answer may be that both forces fed each other in ways no surviving evidence can fully untangle. Then there is the matter of what exactly connected these places in the first place. The Uruk expansion has sometimes been compared to colonialism, sometimes to a trade diaspora, and sometimes to something closer to a shared ideology. A religious or administrative system so compelling that distant societies adopted its outward forms even without direct Uruk political control. Tel Brak, notably, shows evidence of local indigenous urban development running in parallel with, not simply dictated by, Uruk influence, suggesting the network may have been less a single empire radiating outward from one city, and more a constellation of related semi-independent centers bound together by shared technology and trade rather than conquest. If that's true, Collapse may be the wrong word entirely. Perhaps what ended in 3100 BC wasn't a network breaking apart, but a particular kind of connection. One specific version of how distant peoples chose to relate to Uruk, giving way to something else we simply don't have the evidence to name. What's left at Habuba Kabira today is mostly foundation lines in the soil, the ghost of streets once walked by people who came from a city 600 miles away, and then, within a few generations, disappeared from it entirely. No burial evidence explains where they went. No text survives to say why they left, or whether they left willingly at all. The world's first urban network, built with a confidence that assumed permanence, folded itself back into the landscape as quietly as it had first emerged. Was this the end of an experiment that had simply run its course? Or the early world's first recorded lesson in just how fragile even the most sophisticated systems of power can be? The soil at held its own foundation lines, though it would take a British archaeologist named Leonard Woolley, digging in the 1920s, to find them. Woolley's team cut through layer after layer of settlement debris, and roughly 40 feet down, they hit something else entirely. Nearly 3 meters of clean, water-laid silt, utterly devoid of pottery, tools, or any trace of human occupation. Woolley believed he had found physical evidence of the flood, the same catastrophic event that split the Sumerian king list in two. But what waited beneath that silt layer, once his workers dug through it, was arguably stranger than the flood itself. Below the silt, occupation resumed, and in a section of the site, Woolley called the Royal Cemetery of dating to roughly 2600 BC, he found something no one expected. Graves of individuals so lavishly furnished, so surrounded by sacrificed attendants, gold headdresses, lyres, chariots, and precious stone imported from as far as Afghanistan that they seemed to belong to kings and queens of enormous wealth and power. The trouble is that almost none of them appear, by name, in any king list, any inscription, or any surviving record of who actually ruled at that time. 16 of these graves stand apart from the hundreds of ordinary burials surrounding them. Woolley called them royal, partly because of their wealth and partly because of what accompanied the dead. In tomb PG 789, later nicknamed the Great Death Pit, 74 attendants were found laid out in orderly rows, dressed in fine clothing and jewelry, seemingly having gone to their deaths without a struggle. In the tomb of a woman identified by a cylinder seal as Puabi, a name that appears nowhere else in Sumerian records outside her own tomb, a headdress of gold leaves, carnelian, and lapis lazuli was found still resting where her skull had been, alongside dozens more attendants and a small arsenal of grave goods that took Woolley's team months to fully catalog. Puabi is called on her seal a nin, a term that can mean queen, priestess, or a woman of very high status. Which one she was, and over what, remains unresolved. This is where the mainstream account runs into its limits. Sumerian civilization by 2600 BC was not short on record-keeping. Cities like produced administrative tablets by the thousands, inventories, contracts, temple accounts, offerings, wages paid to laborers. And yet not one surviving text names Puabi as a ruling monarch, nor clearly explains who the other so-called royal dead of the cemetery actually were, or how they came to power, or over what territory they reigned. Some scholars argue these individuals may not have been kings and queens of in a political sense at all, but rather high priests, priestesses, or religious officiants whose status came from their role in temple cult rather than secular rule. Figures important enough locally to warrant extraordinary burial, but not important enough, or not the right kind of important, to be recorded in the political king lists that survived. That explanation accounts for the silence in the records. It does not fully account for the human sacrifice. The attendants in these tombs, dozens in some graves, over 70 in the largest, did not appear to die violently or in panic. Their bodies were arranged carefully, their jewelry left in place, their positions suggesting a kind of ritual order rather than the chaos of a massacre. Forensic analysis conducted decades after Woolley's original excavation, using CT scans on skulls recovered from the site, found evidence consistent with a sharp blow to the head, possibly followed by some form of heat treatment to the body. Though whether this was for preservation in Mesopotamia's heat or part of a ritual process is still debated. What compelled dozens of soldiers, musicians, and handmaidens to walk into a mass grave apparently without resistance, to accompany a single individual into death? Was this coerced? Was it an accepted religious duty, understood and perhaps even honored within their society? Or does it reflect a form of political and religious authority so absolute that the idea of refusal simply didn't exist for the people involved? There's a further complication. The royal cemetery of was in use for a relatively short window, and then the practice stops. Later burials at and burials at other Sumerian cities from subsequent periods don't show this same pattern of mass ritual sacrifice on anything close to the same scale. Whatever system of belief or power justified these funerals seems to have been specific to this place and this narrow slice of time. A practice bold enough to leave behind some of the most spectacular grave goods in the ancient Near East, and yet fragile enough, or specific enough, that it left almost no trace in the written record and didn't persist for long. Some scholars have proposed that the individuals in these tombs represent a transitional form of kingship, an early, still developing concept of Sumerian rulership, perhaps tied more closely to religious office than the more secular, dynastic kingship that would follow, and that the later king list was built to document. Under this reading, Puabi and the others may be lost precisely because they predate, or fall outside, the categories later scribes used to define what a king of Sumer actually was. Not erased by accident, but simply uncounted, belonging to a form of authority the later tradition no longer had a name for. Others point to something more unsettling, that history, even in a civilization as textually rich as early Sumer, is written by the institutions that survive and shaped to reflect their version of legitimate power. If Puabi and the royal dead of represented a different structure of authority, one the later dynasties that produced the king list had reason to omit, absorb, or simply forget, then the silence surrounding them may not be an accident of preservation at all. Woolley excavated 16 royal tombs at Only a handful of names survive from them, and only one, Puabi, appears more than once. The soil that buried the flood also buried whatever system of belief could compel dozens of people to lie down beside their ruler and not rise again. Was Puabi a queen forgotten by scribes who had no place for her in their records? Or the last visible trace of a kind of power that Sumer itself chose to leave out of its own story? 4 centuries would pass before the silence at found its echo on a much larger scale. By then, Sumer's fractured city-states had been swallowed into something the region had never seen before, a unified empire built by a man whose own origin story reads like propaganda, too strange to be entirely invented. His name was Sargon, and according to a much later Akkadian text, he was born to a priestess who set him adrift in a basket of reeds on the Euphrates, a story that predates by well over a millennium its more famous biblical echo. Whatever the truth behind his birth, by roughly 2334 BC, Sargon had conquered the Sumerian city-states one by one and founded a new capital, Akkad, at a location so completely lost to history that archaeologists still haven't identified its ruins with certainty. From there, he built what many historians consider the world's first true empire, stretching at its height under his grandson, Naram-Sin, from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean coast. Naram-Sin ruled with a confidence bordering on the absolute. He was the first Mesopotamian king to have himself depicted wearing the horned crown of divinity while still alive, a claim to godhood no predecessor had dared make so openly. The victory stele of Naram-Sin, carved to commemorate a military triumph over a mountain people called the Lullaby, shows the king towering over his enemies, larger than his own soldiers, ascending towards stars that represent the gods themselves. It is one of the most striking pieces of political art to survive from the ancient world, a monument to a ruler who seemed, by every visible measure, untouchable. And then, within roughly a generation or two of his death, the empire he inherited and expanded simply stopped functioning, The Akkadian Empire's collapse, which unfolded sometime around 2154 BC, is one of the most abrupt political failures in the ancient Near East. And for decades, the explanation offered by the Mesopotamians themselves was framed in explicitly moral terms. A later text known as the Curse of Akkad describes the empire's fall as divine punishment, claiming Naram-Sin angered the god Enlil by attacking the god's temple at Nippur, bringing famine, invasion, and ruin down upon the land as retribution. For a long time, historians treated this as exactly what it appeared to be: a piece of political and religious literature composed after the fact to explain a collapse in terms a Mesopotamian audience would find meaningful, and probably written to flatter whichever dynasty rose in Akkad's place. That reading still holds up as literary analysis. What's changed is the physical evidence sitting beneath it. In the 1990s, archaeologists excavating at Tel Leilan, a site in northeastern Syria that had been part of the Akkadian Empire's northern territory, found something unexpected. The site showed clear evidence of sudden abandonment right around the time of the empire's collapse. And beneath the abandonment layer, soil analysis revealed a thick deposit of wind-blown dust, unusually fine and consistent with a prolonged, severe drought. Similar evidence has since been found across the region, and marine sediment cores from the Gulf of Oman, far from Mesopotamia itself, show a spike in wind-blown mineral dust dating to almost precisely the same window, suggesting a climate event large enough to leave a signature far beyond the empire's borders. Some researchers have proposed that a 2 to 3 century-long megadrought struck the region right as the Akkadian state was at its most extended, crippling the rain-fed agriculture that fed its northern territories and severing the empire's ability to move grain and resources to where they were needed. This is now one of the leading explanations for the Akkadian collapse, and it has real explanatory power. An empire that had unified diverse city-states through military conquest and centralized grain distribution would be acutely vulnerable to a shock that disrupted agricultural output across an entire climate zone at once. Famine breeds unrest. Unrest breeds rebellion. And a written tradition that remembered curse and abandonment in the same breath may, in this light, be an oral memory of genuine ecological catastrophe, reshaped into the language of divine punishment, because that was the only framework available to explain something this large. And yet, climate alone doesn't answer every question the collapse raises. For one, the timing and severity of the drought remain contested among climate scientists, with some researchers arguing the evidence from different sites doesn't align as neatly as the megadrought theory requires, and that regional political factors, rebellion among conquered Sumerian cities, pressure from nomadic groups the Akkadians called the Gutians, and the sheer difficulty of governing an empire that size with Bronze Age infrastructure deserve equal or greater weight. The Sumerian king list itself, in a fragment covering this era, describes the Gutian period that followed Akkad's fall in strange, almost dismissive terms, at one point asking rhetorically who the Gutian kings even were, as though the scribes recording the list regarded this era as barely worth taking seriously. A chaotic interruption, rather than a real dynasty. Was this genuine confusion about a period so disordered that clear political succession barely existed? Or a later attempt to erase a period of foreign, non-Mesopotamian rule from the region's sense of its own continuous, self-governed history? There's a deeper problem, too. Naram-Sin's stele shows a king so confident in his own divine legitimacy that he broke centuries of royal convention to depict himself as a god. Within a generation or two, that same dynasty's capital city was abandoned so thoroughly that its exact location remains one of the great unsolved geographic mysteries of Mesopotamian archaeology. Despite centuries of searching, no one has definitively found Akkad. How does a city important enough to give an empire its name, ruled by kings who claim divinity, simply vanish from the map? Was it destroyed so completely that nothing recognizable survived? Buried by the same climate shift that doomed its territories, its ruins now lost beneath silt and centuries of shifting riverbeds? Or does its disappearance suggest the empire's collapse was more violent, more total, than the drought evidence alone implies? An ending erased as deliberately as it was environmentally driven. The Curse of Akkad ends its account of the empire's fall by describing the abandonment of temples and the silencing of the land itself. Whether that silence was written by drought, by rebellion, by the failure of an overextended system of divine kingship, or by some combination the surviving evidence still can't fully separate, one fact remains unchanged. The empire that once stretched from the Gulf to the Mediterranean, ruled by a king who called himself a god, left behind a capital city that no archaeologist has ever definitively found. What exactly happened at Akkad? And what still lies buried beneath wherever it once stood? Every collapse in this story so far has left behind a question about beginnings. Ur's forgotten queens, Akkad's vanished capital. Each mystery keeps circling back to the same unspoken assumption: that civilization itself was already up and running by the time these rulers claimed it. But that assumption deserves its own scrutiny. Because before there were queens to bury or empires to lose, there was a moment when cities did not yet exist at all. And then, in the space of a few centuries, one did, on a scale nothing before it had ever approached. The mound is called Warka today, in southern Iraq, a vast eroded landscape of mud brick ruins baking under the sun. In antiquity, it was Uruk, and by around 3200 BC, it had become, by most archaeological measures, the largest city on Earth. Estimates of its population at peak range from 40,000 to as many as 80,000 people, encircled by a city wall that later legend credited to the hero king Gilgamesh himself, stretching some 6 miles around the settlement. To put that in perspective, for most of human history before this point, settlements meant villages of a few hundred people, perhaps a few thousand at the very largest. Uruk didn't just exceed that scale, it obliterated it, seemingly within the span of a few generations. What makes this growth so striking isn't simply its size, but its speed. Archaeological surveys of the surrounding region show smaller settlements shrinking or disappearing entirely during this same period, their populations apparently drawn into Uruk itself. A pattern researchers call Sinoicism, the merging of separate communities into a single urban center. Within Uruk's precincts, monumental architecture rose just as quickly. The Iana district, dedicated to the goddess Inanna, contains temple complexes built on a scale that required organized labor, planning, and resources far beyond anything a village society would need or could muster. And alongside these buildings, in layers dating to this same narrow window, archaeologists have found the earliest written texts in human history. Thousands of small clay tablets bearing pictographic signs, mostly administrative in nature, recording deliveries of grain, livestock, and labor. Writing, in other words, appears to emerge as a practical tool of accounting almost the exact moment Uruk's population explodes. As if the city had grown too large, too fast, for memory alone to manage it. The standard explanation for Uruk's rise rests on agriculture and irrigation. Southern Mesopotamia's flat alluvial plain, fed by the Tigris and Euphrates, was extraordinarily fertile once irrigation canals were dug to control and distribute river water across the fields. Organizing that irrigation, digging canals, maintaining them, allocating water fairly among competing users, requires exactly the kind of coordinated labor and centralized planning that could plausibly produce a city. Surplus grain feeds specialists, priests, administrators, artisans, soldiers, none of whom need to farm their own food. Surplus population, freed from subsistence farming, builds temples and walls. In this reading, Uruk isn't a mystery so much as a demonstration. Proof that once irrigation agriculture reaches a certain threshold of productivity, urbanization follows as a natural, almost mechanical consequence. It's a satisfying explanation, grounded in solid archaeological and environmental evidence. But it moves quickly past a harder question. Why here, and why then, and why so fast? Irrigation agriculture in southern Mesopotamia didn't begin in 3200 BC. Communities in this region had been managing river water for agriculture for well over 1,000 years before Uruk's population explosion, in scattered village settlements that showed no particular trajectory toward anything like a city. Something changed the equation during the centuries immediately preceding Uruk's rise, commonly called the Uruk period, running from roughly 4000 to 3100 BC. But archaeologists still debate what exactly tipped a landscape of villages into the world's first true urban society. Was it a shift in climate that made irrigation suddenly more productive or more necessary than it had been before? Was it competition between rival settlements, each growing to outmatch its neighbors until one, Uruk, pulled decisively ahead and absorbed the rest? Or was it something closer to an idea, a new form of religious or political authority centered on the temple of Inanna, compelling enough that surrounding communities chose or were persuaded to relocate and consolidate around it? There's a further layer to the puzzle, and it concerns what Uruk's rise made possible almost immediately afterward. The city's explosive growth coincides precisely with the emergence of writing, of standardized administrative systems, of mass-produced pottery so uniform in shape that some archaeologists believe it was designed for standardized rationing rather than individual craftsmanship. Evidence, perhaps, of a labor force being fed and managed at a scale no society had ever organized before. All of this infrastructure appears together in the same narrow window, as though the city didn't simply grow and then develop these tools afterward, but required them from the outset, bootstrapping an entirely new form of social organization into existence almost overnight by the standards of archaeological time. Few technological or social transitions in human history happen this quickly without an identifiable single trigger. Uruk's transition remains, by comparison, oddly abrupt and oddly quiet, in the sense that no myth, no later Mesopotamian text, actually claims to explain why the city grew the way it did. Even the Sumerians themselves, so meticulous about recording king lists and divine mandates, left no account of Uruk's founding as a demographic event. Its origin as a city was simply assumed, a fact of the world rather than a story requiring an explanation. That silence is, in its own way, as strange as anything the physical evidence shows. A civilization that carefully recorded the reigns of legendary kings stretching back tens of thousands of years apparently felt no need to explain how the city those kings supposedly ruled from had grown within a handful of generations, from scattered villages into the largest urban center the world had yet seen. Perhaps the growth was gradual enough, on the ground, that no one living through it recognized it as remarkable. Only later, compressed by archaeological layers into what looks like a sudden leap, does it appear so abrupt. Or perhaps something about Uruk's rise was understood by the people who lived it in terms so basic, so embedded in ordinary religious and economic life, that it required no more explanation than the flooding of the rivers each year. What actually happened in those centuries before 3200 BC, in the fields and villages surrounding a temple to a goddess of love and war that turned a landscape of farmers into the first city on Earth? And why did the very civilization built from that transformation never think it worth telling us how? Picture a workshop floor in the 4th millennium BC, littered with thousands of identical clay fragments, crude, mold-made bowls with sharply beveled rims, fired in a hurry, never meant to last. Archaeologists call them bevel rim bowls, and they are, without exaggeration, the most common artifact of the entire Uruk period. Millions were produced. Most were used once and discarded. And wherever the Uruk world extended its reach, from the Mesopotamian floodplain to the highlands of Iran, from the banks of the Euphrates to outposts 1,000 miles distant, these same crude bowls turn up in the soil, virtually unchanged in shape, as if stamped from a single empire-wide mold. Their presence marks the edges of a phenomenon archaeologists still can't fully explain. Not what the Uruk expansion did, which the physical record shows plainly, but why it happened in the first place. Why a single Mesopotamian city, over the course of a few centuries starting around 3700 BC, extended trade colonies, way stations, and cultural influence across a geography so vast that no comparable urban network would exist again for well over 1,000 years. The dominant framework for understanding this comes from the archaeologist Guillermo Algazi, who in the 1990s proposed what he called world systems theory, applied to ancient Mesopotamia. The idea that Uruk functioned as a resource-hungry core, pulling raw materials from a periphery of less urbanized societies across the highlands and river valleys surrounding it. Under this model, the expansion wasn't organized conquest so much as economic gravity. A city whose population and administrative complexity had outgrown its local resource base, reaching outward again and again toward the metals, timber, and stone it structurally lacked. It's an elegant explanation, and it accounts for much of what's been found. The concentration of Uruk colonies along natural trade corridors, the consistent appearance of administrative tools like cylinder seals and clay tokens at sites far from Mesopotamia itself, the way settlements like Hachanebi in Turkey show Uruk-style artifacts appearing alongside, rather than replacing, local indigenous material culture. But economic necessity alone struggles to explain the sheer speed and cultural confidence of the expansion. Resource scarcity is a constant of life in southern Mesopotamia. It existed for centuries before the Uruk period and continued long after it. What doesn't stay constant is the will and the apparent capacity to act on that scarcity by establishing planned settlements hundreds of miles from home, among peoples who spoke different languages and had never encountered urban society at this scale. Something shifted, sometime in the early 4th millennium BC, that turned a resource problem many earlier societies had lived with into a project of expansion pursued with startling organizational confidence. What was that shift exactly? And was it economic at all, or something closer to ideological? A second theory looks less at what Uruk needed and more at what it believed. Some scholars have proposed that the expansion carried a religious or cosmological dimension, that Uruk colonists weren't simply merchants securing copper and timber, but representatives of a temple-centered worldview, spreading not just goods but an entire administrative and religious order tied to the city's patron deity, Inanna. Under this reading, the strange uniformity of Uruk material culture across 1,000 miles. The same bevel-rim bowls, the same cylinder seal iconography, the same architectural conventions for temple platforms, isn't simply the byproduct of trade convenience. It's closer to a form of missionary consistency, evidence of a belief system compelling enough that distant communities didn't just trade with Uruk colonists, but adopted their material culture wholesale, at least for a time. Mainstream archaeology treats this idea cautiously. Belief is far harder to detect in potsherds and post holes than trade goods are. But the uniformity itself remains difficult to explain purely through commerce. Trading partners typically retain more of their own material identity than what's found at sites like Sheikh Hassan or Jebel Aruda, where entire settlements appear to have been built from the ground up in Uruk style. There's a third puzzle layered beneath both theories, and it concerns consent. Was this expansion something imposed on distant societies, or something they actively invited? At sites like Godin Tepe in the Zagros Mountains, excavators found a small, walled Uruk enclave positioned directly inside a larger local settlement. Not a conquered territory, but seemingly a negotiated foreign quarter, not unlike a trading post established with local permission rather than force. This pattern recurs at several sites. Uruk colonists apparently living alongside, rather than ruling over, indigenous populations who had their own established political structures and showed no particular sign of military coercion. If this is accurate, the Uruk expansion may represent something closer to an ancient trade diaspora than an empire, a network of merchant communities embedded within and dependent on the goodwill of host societies who had their own reasons for welcoming them. But if local societies held real power in this arrangement, why does Uruk material culture so thoroughly dominate the archaeological record at these sites, often with little trace of reciprocal Uruk adoption of local customs? Why does the exchange on the surface look so one-directional if the underlying relationship was closer to partnership than domination? The honest answer is that the evidence doesn't fully resolve into any single, clean story. Different sites appear to tell different versions of the same expansion. Habuba Kabira looking like a planned colonial city built largely from scratch. Godin Tepe looking like a negotiated merchant enclave. Tel Brak looking like an indigenous urban center that adopted and adapted Uruk influence on its own terms, rather than having it imposed. It's possible the Uruk expansion wasn't a single coordinated policy at all, but a patchwork of different relationships, driven by different local circumstances that simply happened to share enough material culture to look, in hindsight and from a great enough archaeological distance, like a unified system. If so, the search for one root cause may be asking the wrong question of evidence that was never going to produce one answer. And yet the bevel rim bowls remain, scattered across 1,000 miles of ancient soil, mute and nearly identical, evidence of something that moved through the ancient Near East with a coherence that still doesn't have a fully satisfying name. Trade network, belief system, diaspora, empire in miniature. Each label captures part of what the evidence shows, and each leaves something unaccounted for. What compelled a single Mesopotamian city, so early in the history of urban life, to imprint its material culture onto a landscape so much larger than itself? And why did a phenomenon this vast leave behind so many objects and so little explanation of its own origin? Among the hundreds of names inscribed on fragments of stone and clay recovered from Sumerian sites, one belongs to a king named Enmebaragesi of Kish, and he holds a distinction that separates him from every ruler discussed so far in this collection. He is, by most scholarly assessments, the earliest king named on the Sumerian king list, whose existence is also confirmed by contemporary archaeological inscriptions, rather than by legend recorded centuries after the fact. Enmebaragesi reigned sometime around 2700 BC, ruling the city of Kish, a city the king list identifies as the first to receive kingship after the Great Flood. His inscriptions have been found at Nippur, suggesting his influence, or at least his religious patronage, extended well beyond his own city's walls. And in Enmebaragesi's reign, historians see something they can finally call, with real confidence, the beginning of documented Sumerian political history. What they still can't fully explain is how the fractured world he ruled ever came to think of itself as a single civilization at all. By the time Enmebaragesi sat on the throne of Kish, Sumer was not one country. It was a patchwork of independent city-states: Uruk, Ur, Kish, Lagash, Nippur, Umma, and others, each with its own king, its own patron deity, its own walls, and often its own ambitions at the expense of its neighbors. And yet these same cities shared a written language, a broadly common religious pantheon, similar architectural and administrative conventions, and a deep, abiding sense that they belonged to something larger than any one city alone, a civilization the Sumerians themselves eventually called Kalam, a word that meant something close to the land, a unifying concept that seems to have existed in the Sumerian imagination well before any single ruler ever managed to unify the region politically. This is the puzzle at the heart of early Sumerian history. Political unification, one king, one empire, ruling all of Sumer under a single administration, doesn't happen until Sargon of Akkad conquers the region around 2334 BC, centuries after cities like Uruk had already reached monumental scale. But cultural and religious unification appears to have arrived far earlier and far more mysteriously. The city of Nippur offers the clearest evidence. Home to the temple of Enlil, the chief god of the Sumerian pantheon, Nippur held no significant military power of its own for much of early Sumerian history. And yet inscriptions from rulers across the entire region, kings who were often at war with one another, repeatedly reference Enlil's blessing or claim legitimacy through recognition at Nippur's temple, as though the city functioned as a kind of shared spiritual capital that transcended, and perhaps even restrained, the political fragmentation surrounding it. How does a civilization arrive at a shared religious and cultural identity like this, centuries before it arrives at shared political rule? The mainstream explanation points to exactly the kind of network explored in the previous chapter: trade, administrative technology, and cultural exchange, flowing between cities that were economically interdependent even when they were politically hostile. Sumerian cities relied on shared irrigation systems fed by the same two rivers, shared trade routes running through the same territory, and a shared writing system that had likely originated at Uruk and then spread city to city, because its practical usefulness for record-keeping outweighed any political rivalry that might have discouraged its adoption. Religion in this reading functioned similarly: a shared mythology and pantheon providing a common cultural language that let rival kings communicate, negotiate, and claim legitimacy using terms every other Sumerian ruler would recognize and respect, even in the middle of active warfare. It's a coherent explanation, and it's almost certainly part of the truth, but it doesn't fully explain the strength or the surprising durability of Nippur's specific religious authority. Consider what Nippur's position implies. Sumerian city-states fought each other constantly during this period, the era historians call the early dynastic period, running roughly from 2900 to 2334 BC, is full of recorded border conflicts. Most famously, an extended territorial war between Lagash and Umma over a stretch of agricultural land called the Guadena, a dispute so bitter it produced some of the earliest known peace treaties and boundary inscriptions in human history. Kings boasted openly of conquering rival cities, destroying their walls, and humiliating their gods. And yet, through all of this, Nippur itself appears to have remained relatively unmolested, its temple to Enlil treated as a kind of sanctified space that ambitious kings sought to honor rather than conquer. Winning recognition at Nippur or securing the temple's blessing seems to have carried a form of legitimacy that military conquest alone could not provide. A king could defeat his rivals in the field and still find his claim to authority incomplete without some acknowledgement from Enlil's priesthood. Why would fiercely competitive, war-prone city-states collectively agree, without, as far as we can tell, any single unifying king forcing the arrangement, to treat one city's temple as sacred common ground? Some scholars suggest this reflects deep, prehistoric roots, that Enlil's cult at Nippur may predate the political rivalries of the early dynastic period entirely, dating back to an era before Sumer's cities had hardened into competing states, when shared religious practice was simply the default condition of a smaller, less differentiated society. Under this theory, Nippur's special status isn't something that had to be actively negotiated during the early dynastic period at all. It's a survival, an inherited arrangement so old that by the time cities like Kish and Uruk were building walls against each other, the idea of Nippur as neutral sacred ground was already too deeply embedded in Sumerian identity to seriously challenge. That's a compelling theory, but it's difficult to test against direct evidence, since it requires reconstructing beliefs from a period that predates most of Sumer's surviving written record. What we can observe more concretely is how later kings used Nippur once political unification finally arrived. When Sargon of Akkad conquered Sumer, he didn't simply impose Akkadian religious practice on the cities he defeated. He installed his own daughter, Enheduanna, as high priestess of the moon god Nanna at Ur, and separately made a point of honoring Nippur's religious institutions, apparently recognizing that conquering Sumer militarily was not the same as inheriting its full legitimacy. Even a king powerful enough to unify the entire region by force still felt compelled to seek validation through channels that predated his empire by centuries. That's a remarkable admission, even an unspoken one, that raw political and military power, however dominant, still deferred to something older and more deeply rooted in how Sumerians understood rightful rule. There's a further layer to this mystery worth sitting with, and it concerns language itself. Despite centuries of warfare, competing dynasties, and shifting political fortunes, the Sumerian language and its cuneiform script remained remarkably stable and mutually intelligible across every city-state in the region. adapted only gradually over centuries, rather than fracturing into dramatically divergent regional forms the way languages often do when political unity breaks down. Even after Akkadian-speaking rulers eventually came to dominate the region, Sumerian persisted for centuries afterward as the language of religion, scholarship, and administration, a prestige language maintained long after it had ceased to be anyone's native tongue, not unlike Latin's afterlife in medieval Europe, but emerging far earlier in human history, and for reasons that remain only partly understood. What sustained this level of linguistic and cultural cohesion across so many independent, frequently hostile political centers for so many centuries, without any single empire enforcing it? Fringe interpretations have occasionally reached for something more dramatic here. The idea that Sumerian cultural unity reflects a lost, much earlier political unification whose memory simply didn't survive in written form, or some deeper prehistoric event that shaped the entire region's identity before the historical record begins. Mainstream scholarship generally finds little direct evidence for this and prefers explanations rooted in gradual cultural transmission, shared economic interdependence, and the practical advantages of a common administrative language. But the underlying observation that makes these fringe theories appealing in the first place is a real one. Cultural unity of this depth and durability, sustained across centuries of political fragmentation and open warfare, is genuinely unusual in the historical record, and the explanations we have, while reasonable, remain frustratingly general when measured against how specific and durable that unity actually was. What Enmebergizi's inscriptions ultimately confirm is that by 2700 BC, Sumer already possessed the core elements of the civilization. Later kings like Sargon would eventually inherit and politically unify by force. A shared language, a shared pantheon, a network of cities that recognized each other as belonging to the same cultural world, even while fighting bitterly over land and water. The question this leaves behind isn't whether Sumerian unity existed before political unification. The evidence for that is solid. It's how a civilization built from constantly warring, fiercely independent cities ever arrived at that underlying sense of shared identity in the first place. Deeply enough that even a foreign conqueror like Sargon felt the need to honor it rather than simply overwrite it. Nippur's temple to Enlil still occupies the same ground it did 4,500 years ago, though little of it remains standing above the sand. Whatever agreement, memory, or belief once persuaded warring kings to treat that ground as sacred and untouchable has left no single inscription explaining itself, no founding treaty, no origin story beyond the myths themselves. Only the pattern remains, city after city, king after king, converging on the same god, the same city, the same unspoken rules, for reasons no single surviving text ever bothered to record. What compelled a civilization this fractured to agree, without ever quite saying so, on what held it together? Legitimacy was the word that kept surfacing in Nippur's story. Kings needing something beyond conquest to make their rule feel complete, seeking blessing from a temple they could not simply seize by force. That same hunger for legitimacy, it turns out, didn't stay confined to temple politics. In time, it pushed at least one Mesopotamian king to reach for something no ruler before him had dared claim outright. Not the favor of a god, but the status of one. The tablet in question is small and unglamorous, an administrative record, one of thousands recovered from the archives of the Third Dynasty of Ur, cataloging offerings, rations, and temple deliveries in the terse, formulaic style Sumerian scribes used for bookkeeping. What makes this particular class of tablets remarkable isn't their content, but a single cuneiform sign attached to a name within them. The 8-pointed star that Sumerian scribes used as the determinative for divinity, normally reserved for gods. Beginning sometime in the reign of a king named Shulgi, who ruled Ur from approximately 2094 to 2047 BC, that star begins appearing directly before his name. Not in poetry, not in a single triumphant monument, but embedded quietly and consistently into the ordinary machinery of government record-keeping, as though his divinity were simply a fact requiring no more comment than the weather. Shulgi ruled for nearly half a century, inheriting and expanding the empire his father, Ur-Nammu had built after the chaos that followed the Akkadian Empire's collapse and the disruptive Guqian period that came after it. He is remembered, in the administrative record at least, as a genuinely capable ruler, a reformer of weights and measures, a builder of roads and way stations, a king whose bureaucracy left behind one of the most extensive archives of any Bronze Age state, tens of thousands of tablets recording an empire run with startling logistical precision. And somewhere in the middle of that long, well-documented reign, Shulgi began referring to himself, and permitting his administration to refer to him, as a living god. This is where the mystery embedded in this chapter's title becomes genuinely difficult to resolve, because Shulgi was almost certainly not the first Mesopotamian king to make this claim, and the identity of who actually holds that distinction depends heavily on which category of evidence you're willing to trust. The strongest earlier candidate is Naram-Sin of Akkad, whose victory stele, carved more than a century before Shulgi's reign, shows him wearing the horned crown of divinity while still alive, ascending toward the stars of the gods themselves. Some later Akkadian-era inscriptions also attach the divine determinative to Naram-Sin's name, suggesting his claim to godhood wasn't merely artistic flourish confined to one monument, but at least partially integrated into how his court formally referred to him. If that evidence is taken at face value, Naram-Sin, not Shulgi, deserves the title explored by this chapter. A king whose confidence in his own divine status 100 years before Ur's third dynasty even existed remains one of the boldest political statements of the Bronze Age. And yet Naram-Sin's divine claim, however striking, appears comparatively isolated. A handful of inscriptions and one extraordinary stele produced by a single uniquely confident ruler at the height of an empire that would collapse within a generation or two of his death. Shulgi's claim to divinity looks different in kind, not just in degree. It shows up not in celebratory monuments alone, but woven into the ordinary bureaucratic fabric of an entire state. Temples built and dedicated to Shulgi's own worship during his lifetime, hymns composed in his honor that survive in multiple copies, and a divine determinative applied to his name with enough consistency, across enough surviving administrative material, that scholars generally regard his deification as a deliberate, sustained state project, rather than a single ruler's personal audacity. Where Naram-Sin seems to have claimed godhood, Shulgi seems to have institutionalized it. Why would two rulers, separated by roughly a century and both presiding over empires built from conquest and centralized administration, arrive at such a similar, extraordinary claim? The mainstream explanation treats this as a predictable response to a specific kind of political problem: the difficulty of legitimizing rule over a large, ethnically and linguistically diverse territory using traditional Mesopotamian kingship alone. Ordinary Sumerian kingship derived its authority from the gods. A king ruled because a god had chosen him, the way Nippur's priesthood conferred legitimacy on rulers who sought Enlil's blessing. But a king who claimed to be a god himself sidestepped that entire negotiation. He no longer needed a temple's endorsement, because he was, by his own declaration, already sacred. For an empire like Akkad or Ur III, ruling over conquered Sumerian cities, incorporated Akkadian populations, and increasingly interacting with distant regions, this kind of direct, unmediated divine authority may have offered a faster, more centralizing route to legitimacy than the older system of temple-sanctioned kingship could provide. That explanation accounts for the motive. It doesn't fully account for the specific timing or why the claim seems to appear and then recede rather than becoming a permanent feature of Mesopotamian kingship going forward. Shulgi's successors in the Ur III dynasty, kings like Amar-Sin and Shu-Sin, continued using the divine determinative for themselves, suggesting the practice had, for a time, become genuinely institutionalized rather than tied to one exceptional individual's personality. And yet by the time the Ur III dynasty itself collapsed, around 2004 BC, under pressure from Elamite invasion and internal strain, the practice of living royal deification largely faded from Mesopotamian political culture. Later kings, including the famous Babylonian ruler Hammurabi centuries afterward, claimed divine appointment and favor in the traditional sense, chosen by the gods, favored by the gods, but generally stopped short of claiming to be gods themselves. Whatever this specific, unusual form of legitimacy offered Naram-Sin and Shulgi's dynasties, later Mesopotamian rulers apparently judged it not worth reviving, or perhaps not available to them in quite the same way. There's a further wrinkle worth sitting with, one that complicates any tidy account of political calculation. The hymns composed for Shulgi don't read like cynical propaganda alone. Many describe him in terms of genuine athletic and intellectual achievement, boasting of his skill as a runner capable of traveling vast distances between cities in a single day, his mastery of scribal arts, his musical ability, his wisdom in judgment. Whether any of this reflects a real man's real accomplishments, exaggerated for effect, or an entirely constructed literary persona designed to justify his divine status, is difficult to determine at this historical distance. But it raises a genuinely open question about how sincerely this deification was believed, by Shulgi himself and by the population governed under it. Was this purely administrative theater, understood by everyone involved as useful political fiction, a language of loyalty rather than literal belief? Or did decades of temples, hymns, and offerings directed at a living king gradually produce something closer to actual religious conviction among at least some of his subjects, blurring the line between constructed legitimacy and genuine felt devotion? Fringe interpretations have occasionally leaned into this ambiguity, suggesting that royal self-deification in Mesopotamia reflects deeper, older beliefs about kingship's cosmic origins. The idea, embedded already in the Sumerian king list, that kingship itself descended from heaven before the flood, meaning kings like Naram-Sin and Shulgi weren't inventing something new so much as reclaiming an authority the earliest Antediluvian rulers were always understood to have possessed. Mainstream historians remain skeptical of drawing a direct line between mythic tradition and political practice, separated by well over 1,000 years of intervening history, and the gap in evidence between the two is real and significant. But the echo is difficult to entirely dismiss. A civilization that began its own historical memory with kings whose authority came directly from heaven eventually produced rulers who dispensed with the intermediary altogether, declaring themselves the source of that authority in their own right. What remains unresolved, sitting at the center of this particular mystery, isn't whether Mesopotamian kings claimed divinity. The tablets and stelae leave no doubt that they did. It's which claim came first in any way that mattered, and why a civilization otherwise so careful about recording precedent, so meticulous about king lists and dynastic succession, left behind competing candidates for a distinction this significant without ever clearly settling the question itself. Was Naram-Sin's stele a singular act of individual audacity, later formalized and expanded by Shulgi into genuine state religion? Or does the fragmentary evidence simply reflect how much has been lost? Earlier kings, earlier claims, perhaps stretching back further than any surviving tablet can now confirm, buried beneath centuries of Mesopotamian soil, along with whatever record might have named, with real certainty, the very first man in the ancient world to declare himself a god while he still had breath to say so. Long before Shulgi claimed a star beside his name, and long before Uruk's walls rose over the plain, there was an older Mesopotamia, one that predates even the vocabulary this collection has used to describe it. Its people didn't speak Sumerian, or at least not the Sumerian preserved in any surviving text. Archaeologists know them only by the name of the site where their distinctive painted pottery was first identified: Ubaid, a modest mound in southern Iraq that gave its name to a culture spanning roughly 6,500 to 3,800 BC, more than 2,000 years before Uruk became the largest city on Earth. The site of Tel al-Ubaid itself is unassuming, easily overshadowed by its more famous neighbor just a few miles away. But what the Ubaid culture built across southern Mesopotamia during its 2.5 millennium span was nothing less than the foundation everything discussed so far was built upon. Ubaid communities pioneered large-scale irrigation agriculture on the Mesopotamian floodplain, centuries before Uruk's canals. They built the first temples at sites like Eridu, the very city the Sumerian king list would later name as the place where kingship first descended from heaven, with each temple constructed directly atop the ruins of the one before it, layer after layer, across more than 1,000 years of continuous religious use at a single sacred spot. They produced fine, wheel-turned pottery traded across enormous distances, reaching the Persian Gulf and beyond. In nearly every meaningful sense, the Ubaid period is where Mesopotamian civilization's deepest roots actually lie. And near the end of that long span, the archaeological record shows something that looks, unmistakably, like the emergence of social hierarchy. Evidence of an elite class distinguishing itself from the rest of Ubaid society for the first time. Then, within a few centuries, that elite appears to vanish, and it's genuinely unclear what happened to them, or where their authority went. The clearest evidence comes from burial practices. Excavations at sites like Eridu and Tel Abada have revealed cemeteries where most Ubaid period graves are relatively modest, but a small number stand distinctly apart, richer in grave goods, sometimes positioned in more prominent locations, occasionally accompanied by items that would have required long-distance trade or specialized craftsmanship to acquire, including obsidian tools sourced from sites in Anatolia hundreds of miles away, and finely made stone vessels. This isn't the extraordinary wealth found later in Ur's royal cemetery, nothing approaching gold headdresses or dozens of sacrificed attendants, but it represents something new for this era. The first clear archaeological signal that some Ubaid individuals held meaningfully more status and likely more authority than others in their community. Alongside this, settlement patterns show a similar trend. Sites like Tel Weli and Eridu grew larger than their neighbors during the later Ubaid period, developing what looked like early administrative or ceremonial centers, complete with monumental temple architecture requiring organized labor to construct and maintain, the kind of coordinated effort that typically implies someone was doing the coordinating. Then, as the Ubaid period gives way to what archaeologists call the Uruk period, starting around 4000 BC, this specific pattern of emerging local elites seems to dissolve. It doesn't vanish because hierarchy disappears from Mesopotamian society. Quite the opposite, hierarchy intensifies dramatically in the centuries that follow, culminating in the kind of concentrated royal and priestly power later visible at Uruk and Ur. But the particular form of Ubaid elite identity, tied to individual burial wealth and apparently distributed across multiple regional centers rather than concentrated in one dominant city, seems to disappear as a distinct social category, replaced by something structurally different. A small number of increasingly powerful urban centers, Uruk chief among them, absorbing authority that had previously been more diffuse. The mainstream explanation for this transition is, in broad strokes, continuity rather than rupture. Most archaeologists don't see the Ubaid to Uruk transition as a collapse or a disappearance in any dramatic sense, but as a gradual consolidation. Smaller Ubaid centers, each with their own modest elite, being slowly absorbed or outcompeted as one settlement, Uruk grew disproportionately large and powerful, pulling population, resources, and political authority toward itself in the same Sinoicism process discussed in an earlier chapter. Under this reading, the Ubaid elite didn't vanish so much as get absorbed, their descendants, or their functional equivalents, becoming part of Uruk's expanding administrative and priestly class, their distinct regional identity swallowed by a single urban center that eventually rendered smaller, independent elites unnecessary. This explanation fits comfortably with the broader arc of Mesopotamian urbanization, and it's almost certainly correct in its general outline. But it moves quickly past a strange discontinuity in the material record that doesn't sit easily within a story of smooth, gradual consolidation. The most puzzling piece of evidence concerns Ubaid material culture itself, and how uniform it was across an enormous territory before this transition took place. Distinctive Ubaid pottery, with its pale greenish-buff clay and dark geometric painted designs, has been found not just throughout southern Mesopotamia, but along the Persian Gulf coast, in eastern Arabia, and north into Syria and Turkey. a spread of cultural influence across hundreds of miles, sustained for well over 1,000 years, without any evidence of the kind of centralized imperial control or colonial network that later characterized the Uruk expansion. Communities across this vast area, seemingly independent of one another politically, nonetheless shared enough contact, trade, and cultural exchange to produce strikingly similar material culture for an extraordinarily long stretch of time. And then, within a few centuries surrounding the Ubaid to Uruk transition, this pattern of broad, loosely connected cultural uniformity gives way to something much more centralized and hierarchical, concentrated overwhelmingly around one city rather than distributed across many. Why would a diffuse, long-lasting, apparently non-coercive network of cultural connection collapse so specifically into concentrated urban power at this particular moment, rather than earlier or later in its 2,000-year run? Some researchers have pointed to environmental factors, shifts in the course of the Euphrates, changing sea levels along the Persian Gulf Coast that would have disrupted the trade routes sustaining Ubaid-era exchange networks, or subtle climatic changes affecting agricultural productivity in ways that favored large-scale, centrally organized irrigation over the more distributed farming patterns of the Ubaid period. Others emphasize purely internal social dynamics, that whatever early elites emerged during the late Ubaid period may have lacked the administrative tools, writing, standardized accounting, the kind of bureaucratic infrastructure that exploded at Uruk, needed to convert local prestige into lasting, transferable political power, meaning their authority was inherently fragile, dependent on individual reputation rather than institutional structure, and thus vulnerable to being outcompeted the moment a genuinely bureaucratic alternative appeared nearby. There's a deeper, more unsettling version of this question worth sitting with, and it concerns what exactly disappearance means in this context. The people of the Ubaid period didn't vanish. Their genetic and cultural legacy almost certainly persisted directly into the population that would go on to build Uruk and speak Sumerian, and there's no evidence of violent replacement or mass depopulation marking this transition. What disappeared, more precisely, was a specific social arrangement, a particular, still poorly understood form of distributed, modestly scaled elite authority that had defined status and power in Mesopotamia for well over a millennium, replaced within a few centuries by something almost unrecognizably different in scale and concentration. Societies don't typically abandon a stable social structure that's worked reasonably well for well over 1,000 years without significant pressure forcing the change. What precisely was that pressure? And why did the region's answer to it converge so specifically on one city, rather than several competing regional centers evolving in parallel, the way cultural change often unfolds? Fringe interpretations occasionally push this observation further than the mainstream evidence supports, suggesting that the Ubaid elite may represent an even older, more sophisticated tradition of governance whose knowledge and authority were deliberately absorbed, appropriated, or suppressed by the rising power of Uruk, a kind of quiet erasure built into the very success of Mesopotamian urbanization. Most archaeologists find little support for anything so deliberate, favoring instead a picture of gradual, largely unplanned social evolution driven by trade, environment, and administrative innovation, rather than conquest or suppression. But even without invoking deliberate erasure, the underlying observation holds a real, unresolved tension. An elite class that took well over a millennium to emerge disappeared as a distinct social category in a fraction of that time, and no surviving evidence, textual or archaeological, records how the people living through that transition understood, explained, or perhaps mourned what they were losing. The temples at Eridu still show their layered history in cross-section, each rebuilding stacked directly atop the last, a physical record of over 1,000 years of continuous religious practice, by a people whose language we've never fully recovered and whose social world we can only partially reconstruct from graves and pottery. Whoever held status among the late Ubaid communities that maintained those temples, generation after generation, left behind graves rich enough to prove their authority was real, and precious little else to explain how that authority worked, who inherited it, or where it went when a single city, a few centuries later, absorbed the region's future and left the Ubaid elite behind as little more than a pattern in the soil. What did it feel like to belong to the last generation whose form of power the world was about to make obsolete? And did anyone at the time understand that this was happening at all? Those layered temples at Eridu, rebuilt atop themselves for 1,000 years, hold a specific kind of information archaeologists prize above almost anything else. Not just faith, but function. Because inside temples like these, particularly at sites further along in Mesopotamia's development, the mud brick walls weren't only sacred space. They were the headquarters of an economy. Storerooms, workshops, and administrative offices where a particular kind of ruler once governed not by right of conquest, but by right of office within the god's own household. Understanding what happened to that ruler and to the system of authority he represented means stepping fully into one of early Mesopotamia's least understood transitions, the shift from temple governance to something closer to the kingship this collection has spent so much time describing. The clearest evidence comes from the city of Lagash, and more specifically its religious center, Girsu, where thousands of administrative tablets dating to the early dynastic period, roughly 2900 to 2334 BC, describe a system of governance built around a temple economy of staggering scale. The temple of the goddess Bau and the temple estate of the city's chief god, Ningirsu, controlled vast tracts of agricultural land, employed thousands of dependent workers, ran textile workshops, managed livestock herds, and maintained granaries that functioned as the city's central bank and insurance policy against famine in one. Presiding over this system was a figure the Sumerians called an ensi, a title usually translated as governor or ruler, but one whose original meaning ties directly to temple administration, possibly meaning something closer to Lord of the Plowland or the one who lays the foundation, language rooted in agricultural and ritual duty rather than military command. This is a genuinely different model of political authority than the one that dominates most of Mesopotamian history as it's popularly understood. An ensi wasn't simply a king who happened to have religious duties. In its earliest form, the office appears to have been understood as a kind of stewardship. The ensi governed a city as the earthly manager of a divine estate, ruling on behalf of the city's patron deity, rather than in his own independent right. Some of the earliest known Lagash rulers, including a figure named Ur-Nanshi around 2500 BC, describe their building projects and irrigation works in terms that frame the ruler's authority as fundamentally derivative, tied to service of the temple and its god, rather than personal glory in the way later kings like Naram-Sin or Shulgi would eventually claim. And yet within a few centuries, this system changes into something recognizably different. Later Lagash rulers, including the well-documented figure of Gudea around 2100 BC, still use the ensi title and still describe themselves in relation to the city's gods. But by this point, the office carries unmistakable trappings of what looks, in practice, like conventional kingship. Personal monuments, extensive statuary commissioned in the ruler's own image and likeness, dynastic succession passed from father to son, and diplomatic and military relationships conducted with neighboring cities in the ensi's own name and authority. Gudea's surviving statues, more than 20 of them recovered from Girsu alone, show a ruler commemorating himself with a scale and permanence that looks far closer to Shulgi's later self-glorification than to the more modestly stewardly language of earlier Lagash inscriptions. Somewhere between Ur-Nanshi and Gudea, the office of ensi seems to have drifted, gradually but unmistakably, from temple administrator toward something functionally indistinguishable from a king. What happened to the original system, and to the specific model of authority it represented? The mainstream historical explanation treats this as an entirely predictable form of institutional evolution, the kind of process political scientists and historians have observed in many unrelated societies, where an office originally defined by religious or administrative duty gradually accumulates personal, hereditary, and increasingly secular power as the individuals holding it, and their families, work to convert temporary stewardship into lasting political capital. Under this reading, the disappearance of the earliest temple governance model isn't a mystery requiring some hidden cause. It's simply what offices tend to do over enough generations, particularly when the office in question controls the kind of vast economic resources a temple estate like Ningirsu's commanded. Whoever held the Ensi title inevitably found ways to entrench their family's hold on that wealth and authority, regardless of the office's original religious framing. That explanation captures something real about how institutions evolve. It struggles, though, to explain the specific texture of what survives from this transition. The sense, running through many of these inscriptions, that the shift wasn't simply personal ambition winning out gradually over religious humility, but something closer to an active, ongoing negotiation between two competing sources of legitimate authority that Sumerian society never fully or explicitly resolved. Consider the language Gudea himself uses, even at the height of his personal glorification. His most famous surviving inscriptions, recorded on large clay cylinders now held in the Louvre, describe in extraordinary detail a dream in which the god Ningirsu personally instructs him to rebuild the god's temple. Down to specific architectural and ritual requirements, Gudea claims to have received directly through divine communication. Even as Gudea commissions dozens of statues celebrating his own image, he frames his greatest achievement not as personal conquest or wealth, but as faithful execution of a god's explicit will, conveyed to him individually and specifically. This isn't the language of a ruler who has fully abandoned the old temple stewardship framework in favor of secular self-glorification. It reads, instead, like a ruler working hard to hold both forms of legitimacy simultaneously, claiming the personal, dynastic permanence increasingly common among Mesopotamian rulers of his era, while still anchoring that authority firmly within the older sacred framework the Ensi title had always implied. Why would this negotiation remain necessary so many centuries into Sumerian political development rather than resolving cleanly into one model or the other? Some scholars suggest the answer lies in exactly the kind of shared cultural framework discussed in an earlier chapter. The deep, durable Sumerian sense that legitimate rule required demonstrated divine sanction, a belief system so deeply embedded that even rulers with genuine independent military and economic power, capable of ruling by force alone if they chose to, still found it necessary, or at least politically advantageous, to frame their authority in terms the temple system had established generations earlier. Under this view, the Ensi title never truly disappeared into pure secular kingship because Sumerian political culture never developed a framework in which authority could be legitimate without some form of demonstrated divine backing, meaning what looks, on the surface, like the gradual erosion of an older system, is actually evidence of that system's remarkable persistence, absorbed into later kingship rather than replaced by it. There's a further complication specific to Lagash that deepens the puzzle. The city's own administrative record includes a striking episode under a ruler named Uruk around 2350 BC, who describes, in one of the earliest known texts framed explicitly as social reform, widespread abuse by prior officials who had exploited temple resources for personal enrichment, seizing land and livestock that properly belonged to the gods and to the city's ordinary citizens. Uruk frames his own reign explicitly as a restoration of proper temple stewardship, a correction of corrupted practice, suggesting that the tension between personal accumulation of power and the older ideal of selfless divine stewardship wasn't simply resolved gradually and peacefully over time, but was, at least at Lagash, contested loudly enough to require formal political reform and public justification. Was Uruk reform a genuine restoration of older values, a shrewd political maneuver dressed in restorative language, or evidence that the corruption of temple governance he describes had already become common enough across Sumerian city-states that his reign stood out as a notable exception rather than the rule? What the Lagash archive ultimately preserves isn't a single clean transition from temple rule to kingship, but a long, evidently unresolved argument about what legitimate authority in Sumer was actually supposed to look like, an argument conducted not through open philosophical debate, as far as any surviving text shows, but through inscriptions, statues, reform decrees, and dream visions, each ruler making his own case for how personal power and divine stewardship could or should coexist. Gudea's statues still sit in museum collections today, their carved eyes fixed in an expression of calm, permanent devotion, commissioned by a man who ruled with more personal authority than any of Lagash's earlier Ensi ever claimed, while still insisting, in his own words, that everything he built began with a god's instruction rather than his own ambition. Was that insistent, sincere belief, careful political theater, or some inseparable mixture of both that Gudea himself may not have fully distinguished? And if even a ruler this powerful still felt bound to frame his authority through the temple's older language, what does that suggest about how fragile, or how enduring, the earliest form of Mesopotamian rule actually was? Not defeated by kingship, perhaps, so much as never fully let go. North of Girsu and its temple archives, roughly 70 miles from Babylon in what is now central Iraq, sits a low mound first excavated in 1926 by a British and American team who uncovered something that didn't quite fit the categories archaeologists had used until that point. The site was called Jemdet Nasr, and the pottery, tablets, and seals recovered there were distinctive enough. Brightly polychrome ceramics, a script transitional between the earliest pictographic writing at Uruk and the more standardized cuneiform that would follow, and administrative practices that seemed to bridge two eras that archaeologists gave the entire period its name, the Jemdet Nasr period, spanning roughly 3100 to 2900 BC, the narrow but pivotal stretch of time sitting between Uruk's explosive rise and the fully formed city-state rivalries of the early dynastic period that produced rulers like Ur-Namshi and Enmebarajesi. For a period this short, barely 2 centuries, Jemdet Nasr left behind a disproportionately large puzzle, because in many ways it represents Mesopotamia at a genuine crossroads, showing features that look forward and backward simultaneously, and then simply stopping, its specific cultural signature fading from the archaeological record almost as quickly as it had crystallized. The tablets from this period are especially revealing, where Uruk's earliest proto-cuneiform texts, dating to roughly 3300 BC, are almost entirely administrative. Inventories, ration lists, labor accounts, lacking any grammatical structure that would let them record actual spoken language. The tablets from Jemdet Nasr show writing edging closer towards something that could express more than simple bookkeeping, incorporating a wider range of signs and beginning to hint at the phonetic principles that would eventually allow Sumerian scribes to write full sentences. It's a genuine transitional technology caught mid-transformation, evidence of a script actively evolving toward literacy in the fuller sense. And yet this specific stage of the script's development, along with the distinctive Jemdet Nasr pottery style and its particular administrative seal designs, doesn't persist much beyond 2900 BC. What replaces it, in the early dynastic period that follows, is recognizably related, but meaningfully different. A more standardized, more widely distributed form of cuneiform, less experimental, already settling into the conventions that would define Sumerian writing for the next 2,500 years. The mainstream explanation for this shift treats it, much like the Ubaid to Uruk transition discussed earlier, as gradual evolution rather than any kind of collapse or disappearance. Writing systems commonly go through unstable experimental phases before standardizing, and the Jemdet Nasr period's transitional script and material culture simply represent one identifiable stage in that longer developmental arc. Not a distinct civilization that ended, but a snapshot of ongoing change that later scholars, working backward from the archaeological layers, chose to name as though it were a separate era. Under this reading, there's no genuine mystery to solve. Jemdet Nasr didn't end. It simply became something else, the way a caterpillar doesn't end so much as continue as a butterfly, the transformation looking more dramatic in hindsight, compressed into museum catalog labels, than it likely felt to anyone living through it in real time. That explanation accounts for the script. It accounts less comfortably for a specific, more physically disruptive pattern that shows up at several Jemdet Nasr period sites right around the transition into the early dynastic period. Evidence of destruction and a notable shift in settlement patterns that doesn't look purely gradual. At several sites dating to this narrow window, archaeologists have found burn layers and destruction debris that suggest violent conflict, and settlement surveys across southern Mesopotamia show a broader pattern of change beginning right around this period. Smaller settlements declining or being abandoned, while a smaller number of larger, more heavily fortified city-states rise to prominence, ringed by defensive walls in a way that earlier Uruk period settlements generally were not. This is, in fact, the period during which Mesopotamian cities first begin building substantial defensive fortifications on a wide scale, a striking change from the earlier, apparently more open pattern of the Uruk expansion, when Uruk-affiliated settlements like Habuba Kabira show comparatively modest defensive architecture given their evident wealth and organization. Something, in other words, made Mesopotamian communities considerably more concerned with defending themselves right around the time the Jemdet Nasr period gives way to the early Dynastic. And that shift doesn't sit easily within a purely peaceful story of scripts quietly maturing and pottery styles gradually changing. What could explain this apparent uptick in conflict and fortification, layered on top of the ordinary cultural evolution the mainstream account already recognizes? Some archaeologists point to population pressure, the continued growth of cities like Uruk and the corresponding decline of smaller independent settlements may have intensified competition over increasingly scarce agricultural land and irrigation water, producing exactly the kind of localized conflict that would explain both the destruction layers and the sudden emphasis on defensive walls. Others point to the aftermath of the Uruk expansion itself, discussed several chapters earlier in this collection. The collapse of Uruk's distant colonial network around 3100 BC would have disrupted established trade relationships and possibly triggered competition among Mesopotamian cities, scrambling to secure resources that had previously flowed in through now severed long-distance networks. Under this reading, the walls rising around Jemdet Nasr period settlements aren't evidence of some external threat or catastrophe, but a direct logical consequence of the very system's collapse explored earlier. Cities that had once cooperated, or at least coexisted, within a shared trade network now finding themselves in more direct competition once that network's benefits disappeared. There's a further dimension to this mystery worth sitting with, and it concerns the seals. Jemdet Nasr period administrative seals show a distinctive iconographic style. Scenes of banqueting, of animals in procession, of what appear to be ritual or ceremonial gatherings, that some scholars have interpreted as evidence of a specific, possibly short-lived political or religious ideology unique to this transitional period, one that doesn't carry forward cleanly into the seal iconography of the early dynastic period that follows. If this interpretation holds, it suggests the Jemdet Nasr period wasn't simply a technical way station between Uruk and early dynastic Sumer, but had, for its brief 2 centuries, its own distinct sense of ceremonial and political identity, one that seems to fade alongside the destruction layers and settlement disruption, replaced by the more familiar, more thoroughly documented city-state culture of rulers like Ur-Nanshe and Enma-Baragesi. Was this specific ceremonial identity a genuine, coherent system of belief and governance that simply lost out to the more militarized, fortified city-state model that followed? Or is the apparent coherence of Jemdet Nasr's material culture an illusion created by archaeologists working with a frustratingly narrow window of evidence, imposing more unity on the period than the people living through it would have recognized? Fringe interpretations have occasionally treated the Jemdet Nasr period's brevity and its transitional oddities as evidence of some kind of external disruption, invasion, migration, even climatic shock severe enough to force a rapid reorganization of Mesopotamian society within the span of 2 centuries. Mainstream archaeology finds only partial support for this in the destruction layers and fortification evidence, and generally favors internal explanations rooted in resource competition and the aftershocks of Uruk's colonial collapse rather than any single dramatic external cause. But even without embracing a more sensational explanation, the underlying tension in the evidence remains real. a period defined by rapid technological advancement in writing, by a distinctive and apparently coherent material culture, and by growing evidence of violence and defensive anxiety, all compressed into less time than a single long human life, giving way afterward to a fundamentally different, more thoroughly fortified world of rival city-states that would go on to dominate Sumerian history for the next 7 centuries. What sits at Jemdet Nasr today is mostly eroded mud brick and the memory of a 2-century window that archaeologists still struggle to fully characterize. Neither simply an early chapter of Uruk's story, nor a fully separate civilization in its own right, caught instead in the narrow, unstable space between one form of Mesopotamian society and another. The script found there was reaching toward full literacy and then set aside in favor of something more standardized. The seals suggest a ceremonial world that doesn't survive intact into the period that follows. And scattered among the pottery and tablets, the burn layers remain, marking a transition that may have been as violent and contested on the ground as it looks abrupt in the archaeological layers above it. What exactly was lost in those 2 centuries between Uruk's peak and the rise of the walled city-states that followed? And was Jemdet Nasr's brief, unfinished culture a road Mesopotamia simply outgrew, or one it was forced to abandon before it had the chance to fully become itself? Imagine the weight of a stone cylinder no bigger than a spool of thread, rolled across wet clay to leave behind a continuous frieze of impossible detail. Men, animals, boats, buildings, repeating in an unbroken band wherever the seal turns. Among the thousands of such cylinder seals recovered from Uruk's ruins, a handful carry a recurring image. A bearded man wearing a distinctive round cap, engaged in acts no ordinary citizen could plausibly perform. Feeding sacred herds, subduing lions with his bare hands, presiding over what looks unmistakably like ritual and political authority. Archaeologists call this recurring figure the priest king of Uruk, and he appears not just on seals, but on some of the finest surviving art of the entire Uruk period, including the famous limestone Uruk vase and a small alabaster mask known as the Mask of Warka. What no one can say with confidence is his name. This is, in some ways, the oldest identity mystery this collection has to offer, because it sits at the very beginning of Mesopotamian political leadership, before Enmeber-Egizi, before the Sumerian king lists antediluvian kings, before even the notion of king as a formal title had necessarily crystallized into the form later scribes would use. The priest-king imagery dates to roughly 3300 to 3000 BC, precisely the period when Uruk was exploding into the world's first true city, and precisely the period from which no securely readable royal name has ever survived attached to this specific figure. The Uruk vase, discovered at the site's Iana precinct, and now one of the most studied objects in Mesopotamian archaeology, shows the priest-king in its uppermost register, receiving offerings before a female figure widely interpreted as the goddess Inanna or her high priestess. While beneath them, in descending bands, a procession of naked male attendants carries baskets of produce, followed by rows of domesticated animals and rippling depictions of the Euphrates itself. It is, in effect, a visual summary of Uruk's entire economic and religious order, compressed onto a single vessel roughly 3 feet tall, and at its symbolic center stands a figure whose authority is depicted with total confidence and whose actual historical name has never been recovered. The mainstream explanation for this gap is straightforward, if unsatisfying. Writing simply hadn't developed far enough yet. The earliest proto-cuneiform tablets from Uruk, dating to this same general period, are administrative in nature. Tallies of grain, livestock, and labor, using pictographic signs that recorded quantities and categories of goods, not personal names or narrative sentences. The technology needed to write "so-and-so ruler of Uruk" simply may not have existed yet in a form capable of reliably encoding a specific human name for later readers to recover. Under this reading, the priest-king isn't a mystery in the dramatic sense. He's simply a real historical figure, or more likely a series of real rulers holding a shared ceremonial role, operating at a moment when Mesopotamian civilization had developed sophisticated art, monumental architecture, and complex economic administration. but not yet the specific written tool that would have let him introduce himself to history by name. This explanation is almost certainly part of the truth, but it leaves open a series of harder questions the imagery itself seems to invite. Questions about whether priest-king describes one continuous office passed between different individuals, or whether it points to something more specific and personal that later tradition simply failed to preserve. The first question concerns continuity. Because the priest-king imagery appears with remarkable consistency across multiple different objects, media, and contexts throughout the late Uruk period, some scholars have proposed that priest-king wasn't the personal identity of a single memorable ruler at all, but a kind of visual shorthand for an office, a role any qualified individual might occupy and be depicted fulfilling, the way a modern crown or throne can represent the monarchy as an institution rather than any specific monarch. Under this reading, asking for the priest-king's name may be asking the wrong question entirely, similar to asking for the personal name of the pharaoh depicted on a piece of unlabeled Egyptian temple relief without further context. The consistency of the imagery in this view reflects consistency of role, not evidence of one man's unusually long or memorable reign. But this institutional reading sits uneasily against a specific detail preserved in later Sumerian tradition. The Sumerian king list itself, and independent literary works composed centuries afterward, do preserve names for early rulers of Uruk, including figures like Enmerkar, Lugalbanda, and Gilgamesh, all associated with Uruk's early dynasty, and all wrapped to varying degrees in legendary and semi-mythical material. Enmerkar in particular is credited in later tradition with founding aspects of Uruk's greatness, including in one text known as Enmerkar and the Lord of Arata, an origin story for writing itself, describing the invention of a system for pressing signs into clay because a messenger could no longer reliably memorize an increasingly complicated message. If Sumerian oral and literary tradition preserved names for early Uruk rulers at all, even wrapped in legend, why does the specific, vivid, art-historically dominant image of the priest-king appearing across dozens of surviving objects never seem to connect cleanly to any of them? Is Enmerkar himself the priest-king depicted on the Uruk vase, his name simply detached from the image by the accident of missing or ambiguous inscriptions? Or does the persistence of the priest-king motif represent an earlier, separate tradition of authority that predates even the earliest kings later Sumerian scribes chose to remember by name? Meaning the figure on the vase may belong to a political world the later king list doesn't fully capture at all. There's a further complication specific to the Uruk vase that deepens rather than resolves this puzzle. The vase was looted from the Iraq Museum in the chaos following the 2003 invasion of Iraq, its upper register, including the priest-king's face, smashed in the process, and while the vase itself was later recovered and painstakingly reconstructed, the incident is a stark reminder of how fragile and contingent our access to this evidence actually is. Much of what we know about the priest-king comes from a relatively small number of surviving objects, each individually vulnerable to damage, loss, or destruction, meaning any confident conclusion about his identity, singular or institutional, rests on a smaller and more precarious body of evidence than the sheer visual power of the imagery might initially suggest. Fringe interpretations have occasionally proposed that the priest-king represents a specific, historically real founding figure whose memory was later mythologized into legendary characters like Enmerkar, or even Gilgamesh himself, the layers of legend accumulating around a genuine Uruk ruler until the historical kernel became inseparable from the myth built around it. Mainstream Assyriology treats this kind of direct identification with considerable caution, noting that centuries separate the earliest priest-king imagery from the composition of texts like the Gilgamesh epic, and that the process of legendary elaboration in Mesopotamian tradition was rarely so simple or traceable. But the underlying instinct behind the theory reflects something real about the evidence. A civilization that would go on to develop extraordinarily rich literary traditions about its own early kings, populated with named heroes and detailed, if embellished, biographical incident, somehow left its most visually dominant and artistically confident image of early leadership almost entirely unlabeled. What remains then is an image without a name attached to a name without a confirmed image. The priest king staring out from cylinder seals and carved stone with an authority too consistent and too deliberate to be accidental, while in Merkar, Lugalbanda, and the other early rulers preserved in later Sumerian literature exist mostly as words on tablets composed centuries after the fact, their physical likenesses, if they were ever depicted at all, lost or unidentified among the thousands of unlabeled objects still emerging from Mesopotamian soil. Perhaps future excavation, or a chance inscription finally paired with unmistakable certainty to the priest king's familiar profile, will close this gap. Until then, the man who may have been Uruk's very first ruler remains exactly what his surviving portraits show him to be. Supremely confident, instantly recognizable by his cap and his posture, and the animals he subdues with his bare hands, and after more than 5,000 years, still entirely unnamed. Twice now this collection has arrived at the same uncomfortable conclusion from different directions, that Mesopotamia's earliest and most confidently depicted rulers are, more often than not, its most anonymous. The priest king of Uruk stares out from cylinder seals with total authority and no name attached to him. Now the trail leads somewhere even older and even stranger, to the one city every surviving Mesopotamian tradition agreed was first. Eridu sits today as one of the most remote and least visited archaeological sites in southern Iraq, a low, wind-scoured mound near the edge of the desert, far enough from the modern course of the Euphrates that it's difficult to picture it as it once was. A settlement on the marshy edge of the ancient river system, founded according to radiocarbon dating of its earliest occupation layers, sometime around 5400 BC. This makes Eridu not just old by Mesopotamian standards, but old by the standards of urban settlement anywhere on Earth, one of the very first places human beings gathered in numbers large enough and with enough permanence to be called a town rather than a village. And at the heart of Eridu's ancient mound sits the feature that gives this chapter its subject. A temple, rebuilt in place across more than a dozen successive construction phases, dedicated from its very earliest incarnation to a god named Enki, lord of wisdom, magic, and the fresh water that Mesopotamians believed flowed beneath the earth itself. The Sumerian king list, the same tablet whose antediluvian numbers open this entire collection, begins, without ambiguity or hesitation, at this exact spot. When kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. The very first line of Mesopotamia's oldest surviving political document names this city, this modest mound now sitting nearly 40 miles from any major settlement, as the place where the entire institution of rulership began. And the very first king it names, Alulim, is credited with a reign of 28,800 years before the flood arrives, and the list moves on. No later Sumerian tradition seriously disputes Eridu's status as the first city where kingship existed. What no tradition, ancient or modern, has ever been able to supply is any real information about who Alulim actually was, or whether Alulim reflects the memory of an actual individual at all. This puts Eridu's founding king in a genuinely unusual category of historical uncertainty, stranger, in some ways, even than the priest king of Uruk. The priest king, at least, left behind vivid, detailed physical portraits, a face, a posture, a repeated visual identity that later viewers could recognize even without a name attached. Alulim left behind nothing but a name and a number, inherited by scribes who copied and recopied the king list for well over 1,000 years, without, as far as any surviving evidence shows, ever questioning or elaborating on who this founding figure had actually been. He has no epic composed about him, no myth describing his deeds, no surviving artwork claiming to depict his face. He exists in the entire body of surviving Mesopotamian literature, almost exclusively as a single line in an administrative-style list, a founding figure remembered by title and duration of reign, and by nothing else at all. The mainstream scholarly explanation for this thinness treats Alulim's name with real caution, generally regarding him not as a historical individual in any meaningful sense, but as a symbolic or eponymous figure, a name attached retroactively to Eridu's status as Mesopotamia's oldest city, serving a structural, almost mathematical purpose within the king list's broader project of establishing an unbroken chain of divinely sanctioned rulership stretching back to civilization's absolute beginning. Under this reading, asking who Ululim really was may be asking a question the evidence was never built to answer, in the same way that asking for the personal biography of a figure in a genealogical creation myth misunderstands what that kind of text is actually designed to do. The king list in this view isn't attempting biography for its earliest entries. It's establishing a theological and political claim that kingship itself is ancient, sacred, and unbroken, with Eridu positioned as the sacred point of origin specifically because archaeological reality, even in antiquity, already marked it as the oldest settlement anyone still remembered. This explanation accounts for the absence of biographical detail. It accounts less comfortably for a genuinely strange archaeological pattern found at Eridu itself, one that suggests the city's earliest inhabitants were preoccupied with questions of origin and precedence in ways that go beyond ordinary religious practice. The temple sequence at Eridu is the key piece of evidence here, and it is, without real exaggeration, one of the most remarkable structures in world archaeology. Excavations conducted in the 1940s revealed that the temple dedicated to Enki wasn't simply rebuilt once or twice over time, the way many ancient religious structures were periodically renovated. It was rebuilt at least 18 times, directly atop the same footprint, across a span of roughly 2,000 years, from the site's earliest Ubaid period occupation straight through into the historical periods discussed throughout this collection. Each new temple was constructed on a slightly raised platform built directly over the ruins of its predecessor, preserving the exact sacred location with an almost obsessive fidelity. Generation after generation, culture after culture, language after language, long after the people building the newest version could have had any direct memory of who had built the very first. Why would this specific location be treated with such extraordinary sustained reverence, maintained continuously across a span of time longer than the entire distance separating us today from the founding of ancient Rome? Some archaeologists suggest a straightforward explanation rooted in Eridu's unique geography. The temple sat near a natural spring or unusually reliable source of fresh water in a landscape where fresh water was scarce and precious, meaning the site's sacred status may have originated in genuine, practical reverence for water itself, Enki's specific domain, reinforced and formalized over centuries into full religious tradition. Under this reading, the temple's remarkable rebuilding sequence isn't really evidence of memory reaching back to any specific founding individual, but evidence of a location's practical and symbolic importance, proving durable enough that successive cultures, even ones with little direct cultural continuity with Eridu's earliest Ubaid period inhabitants, kept independently choosing to honor the same spot. But this doesn't fully explain why later Sumerian traditions specifically insisted on naming Eridu, and only Eridu, as the place where kingship itself began, a claim distinct from, and more specific than, simple reverence for a useful water source. Every other city discussed throughout this collection, from Uruk to Ur to Lagash to Akkad, eventually produced kings whose names, deeds, and personalities survive in reasonable detail, even when uncertainty surrounds specific claims or dates. Eridu alone occupies the paradoxical position of being universally acknowledged as first, and yet almost entirely empty of specific textured historical memory about what that firstness actually consisted of. It's as though later Sumerian civilization agreed, with real consistency across multiple independent textual traditions, that something foundational had happened at Eridu, while simultaneously possessing almost no concrete information about what that founding moment had actually involved, or who had presided over it. There's a further, more unsettling possibility buried in this gap, one that mainstream Assyriology treats with appropriate caution but doesn't entirely dismiss. That Eridu's status as the place where kingship descended from heaven may reflect a genuine, deep folk memory of the actual transition from small Ubaid period settlement to something resembling organized political authority. A real historical development, occurring so early and so gradually that no individual founder ever existed in the way later tradition imagined one, the process itself too diffuse and incremental to be captured by any single origin story, even as later generations, uncomfortable with an origin this formless, retroactively supplied it with a name, a number, and a place to make the beginning of political order feel as definite and locatable as everything that followed it. Alulim's name endures for one simple reason. Because Eridu's temple, rebuilt 18 times across 2,000 years on the exact same sacred ground, gave later Sumerians a fixed point they were determined to honor as the beginning of everything. Even after any real information about what had actually happened, there had already been lost for longer than most civilizations managed to survive at all. The mound at Eridu still holds that layered temple beneath its sand, each rebuilding a kind of vote of confidence in a beginning nobody could actually describe. What precisely happened on that spot, in a landscape of reed marshes and fresh water springs, that convinced every generation of Sumerians who followed that kingship itself had to have started exactly there. And was Alulim ever a person at all? Or only the name a much later world gave to a beginning it could no longer remember, but refused to leave unmarked? The flood that split the Sumerian king list in two did more than end a dynasty. It ended an entire era of place. Before it, kingship had migrated between 5 antediluvian cities: Eridu, then Bad Tabira, then Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak, each receiving the sacred office in turn, according to the list, before the deluge swept over everything. After it, the tablet states, kingship again descended from heaven, and this time it landed at Kish. It is the same phrase, word for word, repeated across the flood's dividing line, as though the scribes themselves wanted their readers to understand that whatever legitimacy had existed before the catastrophe had survived it intact, transferred cleanly to a new city on the other side. What the king list does not explain is the 23 kings it goes on to name at Kish, most of whom left behind absolutely nothing else. No inscriptions, no building projects, no independent confirmation from any other surviving Mesopotamian source that they existed at all. This is where Kish's dynasty becomes a genuinely distinct puzzle from the antediluvian kings already explored earlier in this collection. Those pre-flood rulers, with their reigns of tens of thousands of years, were always understood, even by many ancient readers, as belonging to a symbolic or semi-mythical register of time. Kish's dynasty is different. It's presented as the first fully post-flood historical-feeling sequence of Mesopotamian kingship. Reign lengths measured in decades and centuries rather than tens of thousands of years. A tone that reads, on the page, as an attempt at genuine record-keeping rather than cosmological symbolism. And yet of the 23 names the list provides for this dynasty, only the very last, Enmabir-Jezi, has ever been confirmed by an independent contemporary inscription. The same votive evidence, found at Nippur, that opened the discussion of Sumer's cultural unification several chapters ago. Every king before him at Kish exists, as far as the archaeological record currently shows, in exactly one place. This single administrative-style document, copied and recopied by scribes centuries after the fact. The mainstream explanation for this gap leans on the specific and unusual textual history of the king list itself. Unlike a modern historical chronicle, compiled shortly after the events it describes, the king list as we have it survives primarily in copies made during the Isin-Larsa and Old Babylonian periods, roughly 2000 to 1600 BC, meaning the version historians actually study was compiled centuries, in some cases well over a millennium, after the reigns of the earliest Kish kings it claims to document. Scholars generally believe the list drew on some combination of genuine older records, local city traditions, and king lists specific to individual cities like Kish, all synthesized later into one continuous unified sequence, likely for explicitly political purposes, to demonstrate that legitimate kingship had passed through an unbroken, singular line, when the reality on the ground had probably been far messier, with multiple cities holding real, simultaneous power rather than one city cleanly inheriting supremacy from the last. Under this reading, Kish's 23 kings aren't necessarily fictional so much as compressed and reorganized, their individual reigns possibly real, but stitched together into a tidier sequence than Mesopotamian political reality had actually produced. This explanation accounts for a great deal. It doesn't fully account for the sheer strangeness of some of the specific names and reign lengths the list preserves for this dynasty. Details oddly specific for entries otherwise unsupported by any independent evidence. The list's second Kish king, Kulasina Bel, is given not a straightforward royal name at all, but what appears to be a full Sumerian sentence functioning as a name, one that roughly translates to something like, "all of them were lord," or a phrase of similarly ambiguous, almost riddling structure. Later in the same dynasty, a king named Etana appears, and unlike his neighbors on the list, Etana did not remain confined to bureaucratic silence. He became the subject of a genuine literary tradition, a Sumerian and later Akkadian myth describing a king so desperate for an heir that he flew to heaven on the back of an eagle to retrieve a magical plant capable of curing infertility. The king list, notably, describes Etana in language distinct from the sparse formula used for the kings around him, calling him explicitly the one who stabilized all countries and who ascended to heaven. Direct textual acknowledgement, embedded in an otherwise dry administrative document, of the myth that had already attached itself to his name by the time later scribes were compiling the list. Why would one king out of 23 receive this kind of narrative elaboration, while the others remain almost entirely blank? One explanation holds that Etana's story was simply a more popular, more widely circulated piece of oral literature by the time the king list was compiled, giving scribes actual textual material to draw from that simply didn't exist or hadn't survived for his fellow Kish rulers. Under this reading, the unevenness isn't evidence that Etana was more historically real than his neighbors. It's evidence of which stories happen to survive long enough to be written down, an accident of cultural transmission rather than a meaningful signal about any king's underlying historicity. But this raises a harder related question. The mainstream explanation doesn't fully resolve. If genuine historical memory of the early Kish dynasty was this thin by the time the king list was compiled, why include such a long, specific sequence of 23 names at all, rather than simply compressing the era the way the Antediluvian section compresses an entire pre-flood age into 8 rulers across 5 cities? The sheer length and granularity of the Kish list, compared to the relative brevity of the periods before and immediately after it, suggests the compilers believed they were working with something more substantial than pure invention. Whether that substance came from genuine older written records now lost to us, from a rich oral tradition specific to Kish that simply didn't survive independently the way Etana's myth did, or from local temple or administrative archives at Kish itself that predate the version of the king list we can actually read today. There's a further layer worth considering, one that connects back to Kish's specific political importance in later Mesopotamian tradition. Even after other cities like Uruk and rose to prominence, the title King of Kish persisted for centuries as an honorific claimed by rulers who held no direct connection to the city itself, used as a way of asserting supremacy over the whole of Sumer, rather than simple, local rule. Sargon of Akkad used it. Later, rulers used it. This suggests Kish's dynasty, whatever its precise historical accuracy, carried enormous symbolic weight throughout Mesopotamian political culture for well over 1,000 years after Enmebaragesi's actual confirmed reign. Weight substantial enough that inventing, embellishing, or simply preserving 23 predecessors for him may have mattered enormously to later scribes, regardless of how much verifiable information they actually possessed about any individual king in that sequence. What survives in the end is a tablet listing 23 names, one riddling non-name, one mythic aviator, and one figure, Enmebaragesi, whose reign alone has stepped fully out of the list and into the light of independent archaeological confirmation. Between the flood and that first confirmed king, Mesopotamian tradition insists something substantial happened at Kish, a genuine dynasty, ruling long enough and consistently enough to earn a title later empires would still be claiming 1,000 years afterward. Whether that dynasty existed largely as the list describes it, or whether 22 names were quietly gathered, compressed, or invented to give a real king like in Mebarajesi the kind of ancient, unbroken pedigree Mesopotamian legitimacy seemed to require, remains exactly as unresolved as it was when scribes in Eson or Larsa first copied the sequence down, centuries after anyone could have checked.